Georgy Zhukov is a name that will forever be inscribed in gold letters in the history of mankind. Marshal of victory, savior of Moscow, conqueror of Berlin, the man who turned the tide of the most terrible war of the 20th century. But who was he really? A brilliant strategist or a ruthless commander? A hero or a tyrant? Today we will tell the truth about the man who determined the fate of millions and changed the course of world history. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes about the great figures of history. And be sure to write in the comments whether you think Zhukov's harsh methods were justified, if they saved millions of lives, or was the price of victory too high? Your opinion is very important to us. On December 1st, 1896, in the small village of Strelkovka in the Kaluga province, a boy was born who was destined to become one of the greatest military leaders in human history. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was born into a peasant family where poverty was a constant companion. His father, Konstantin Artemyevich, worked as a shoemaker, while his mother, Ustinya Artemyevna, took care of the household and raised the children. The family lived in a small hut, where every square meter was precious. The future marshal's childhood was spent in the harsh conditions of a Russian village at the beginning of the 20th century. At the age of 8, the boy already knew what hard physical labor was. He helped his father in the workshop, herded cattle, and worked in the fields. These early years tempered Georgy's character and taught him patience and perseverance, qualities that would later make him an invincible commander. He attended only 3 grades at the village school. His family could not afford more education. At the age of 11, Georgy was sent to Moscow to live with his uncle, who was a furrier. The boy had to learn the trade and help his family. Life in the capital turned out to be no less harsh than in his native village. He worked as an apprentice, slept on the floor in the workshop, and endured beatings and humiliation. But it was here, in the back streets of Moscow, that the future marshal's iron character was formed. He learned not to give up, to overcome any difficulties, and to pursue his goals despite obstacles. In 1914, 18-year-old Georgy was drafted into the army. World War I had begun, and the young recruit found himself in the thick of battle. He was sent to the 5th Sversky Dragoon Regiment, where he served as a non-commissioned officer. The war became a real school of life and death for Zhukov. Here, he encountered the horrors of modern combat for the first time and learned to make quick decisions under enemy fire. Zhukov particularly distinguished himself in the battles near Brusilov in 1916. During one of the attacks, he was seriously wounded when a German mine exploded nearby and a piece of shrapnel hit him in the chest. The young dragoon spent several months in the hospital, hovering between life and death. But he survived and returned to the ranks even more hardened and experienced. For his bravery in battle, Georgy was awarded 2 St. George's Crosses, the highest award for lower ranks in the Russian army. After the October Revolution of 1917, Zhukov, like many officers of the old army, was faced with a choice. He could have emigrated or tried to disappear into the crowd. But he chose a third path, serving the new government. In 1918, he joined the Red Army and was sent to the front lines of the Civil War. This decision determined his entire future. In the ranks of the Reds, Zhukov fought against Denikin's troops on the southern front and took part in battles against Wrangel in Crimea. Here he commanded first a platoon, then a squadron, demonstrating his extraordinary abilities as a cavalry officer. He was distinguished by his bravery, ability to quickly orient himself in combat situations, and make unconventional decisions. Even then, his comrades in arms noticed in him the makings of a future commander. Particularly memorable was an episode in the battles near Tsaritsyn, where Zhukov's squadron was surrounded by White Guard troops. It seemed that there was no way out, but the young commander managed to find a weak spot in the enemy's ring and lead his men out with minimal losses. This incident showed that Zhukov possessed not only personal bravery, but also strategic thinking and the ability to see the battlefield as a whole. After the end of the Civil War, Zhukov remained in the Red Army. He understood that peacetime was a time for learning and improvement. Despite his limited education, he persistently studied military theory, read the works of the great commanders of the past, and analyzed the experience of recent battles. His natural quick-wittedness, combined with iron perseverance, allowed him to master the most complex issues of military science. In the summer of 1939, a conflict broke out on the distant border with Mongolia, which few in the world took seriously. Japanese troops violated the border in the Khalkhin Gol River area, seeking to test the strength of the Soviet defenses. Tokyo expected an easy victory over the backward Red Army, underestimating Moscow's determination to defend every meter of its territory. 43-year-old Brigade Commander Georgy Zhukov was appointed commander of the troops sent to repel the aggression. Upon arriving at the scene of the fighting, Zhukov immediately understood the scale of the problem. The Japanese had a significant advantage in aviation, and their troops were well trained and equipped with modern weapons. The Soviet units stationed in Mongolia, on the other hand, lacked everything they needed, from ammunition to fuel. Supply lines stretched for thousands of kilometers across rough terrain, and every kilogram of cargo was delivered with great difficulty. But Zhukov was not one to give up in the face of adversity. He immediately began a detailed study of the enemy and the terrain. Day and night, the commander studied maps, analyzed intelligence data, and personally visited the front lines. Gradually, a plan for an operation took shape in his mind, one that would not only repel the Japanese, but also deal them a decisive defeat. A key feature of Zhukov's plan was the close coordination of tanks and aircraft. At that time, this was a revolutionary tactic that no one else in the world had yet used. The commander understood that in open terrain, it was the mobility and firepower of armored units that could be the decisive factor in victory. He managed to transfer a significant number of tanks and aircraft to Khalkhin Gol. On August 20th, 1939, the Soviet offensive began. Zhukov personally directed the operation from the forward command post, from where he could see the battlefield. The attack unfolded according to a strictly rehearsed plan. First, powerful artillery preparation, then an airstrike, and only after that, an offensive by tanks and infantry. The Japanese, accustomed to traditional methods of warfare, were unprepared for such an onslaught. The double encirclement of Japanese positions by tank brigades was particularly effective. While the enemy was repelling the frontal attack, Soviet tanks bypassed its flanks and struck at its rear communications. The Japanese group found itself in a cauldron from which escape was virtually impossible. Zhukov demonstrated a brilliant understanding of the principles of modern motorized warfare. In 4 days of fighting, the Japanese army was completely destroyed. The enemy's losses amounted to more than 25,000 killed and wounded, while Soviet troops lost significantly fewer. It was an unconditional victory that forced the Japanese military command to radically revise its plans regarding the USSR. Tokyo realized that the Red Army was a serious opponent. The victory at Khalkhin Gol brought Zhukov nationwide fame and the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Stalin carefully studied reports on the actions of the young commander and came to the conclusion that in Zhukov, the Red Army had found a new type of commander. It was from this moment that Georgy Konstantinovich began his ascent to the top of the Soviet Union's military hierarchy. Analyzing the experience of the Khalkhin Gol battles, military theorists around the world recognized that the Soviet commander had demonstrated a new understanding of the capabilities of modern technology. The massive use of tanks and aircraft in offensive operations became a model to emulate. Zhukov proved that it was not the size of the army that would be decisive in future wars, but its technical equipment and skilled leadership. In the pre-war years, the Soviet Union was feverishly preparing for the impending battle with Nazi Germany. Stalin understood the inevitability of conflict, but hoped to delay its onset for a few more years. During this time, it was planned to complete the reorganization of the Red Army, equip it with modern technology, and train command personnel. Georgy Zhukov, who gained a reputation as one of the country's best commanders after Khalkhin Gol, played a key role in these preparations. In January 1940, Zhukov was appointed commander of the Kiev Special Military District, one of the most important in the USSR's defense system. This district covered a strategically important area in Ukraine, where the main German attack was expected in the event of war. The new commander threw himself into the work of strengthening the defenses of the territory entrusted to him. He understood that time was working against the Soviet Union, and that every day of delay could cost thousands of lives. Zhukov demanded strict discipline and constant combat readiness from his subordinates. He personally inspected the fortifications on the border, conducted surprise checks of the troops, and organized large-scale exercises. Many officers complained about what they considered to be the excessive strictness of the new commander. But Georgy Konstantinovich was unyielding. He knew the price of military unpreparedness and had no intention of repeating the mistakes of the past. The commander paid particular attention to studying the German experience of warfare. The Blitzkrieg in Poland and the defeat of the French army showed that the Wehrmacht had mastered fundamentally new methods of warfare. The massive use of tank formations, supported by aviation, allowed the Germans to break through any defense and develop their offensive at a rapid pace. Zhukov understood that special countermeasures were needed against such tactics. In December 1940, a meeting of the Red Army's top command was held in Moscow to discuss preparations for war. Zhukov gave a report on the nature of modern warfare, based on an analysis of German operations in Europe. He warned of the need for a radical overhaul of Soviet military doctrine, pointing out the danger of underestimating the enemy. The report made a strong impression on those present, but not everyone shared Zhukov's pessimism about the Red Army's readiness for war. Many commanders believed that the numerical superiority of Soviet troops would compensate for any tactical innovations by the Germans. Zhukov, however, insisted on the need for a radical modernization of the army, the creation of large tank formations, and the improvement of the troop command system. In May 1941, Zhukov was appointed Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. This appointment was a recognition of his outstanding abilities, but at the same time presented him with extremely difficult tasks. The new Chief of the General Staff had only a few weeks to complete the Army's preparations for a war that, by all indications, was about to begin at any moment. Zhukov immediately set about developing plans to defend the western borders of the USSR. He assumed that the Germans would try to repeat their successes in Poland and France, launching several powerful tank strikes with the aim of encircling and destroying the main forces of the Red Army in the border areas. The Soviet defense had to be built in depth, with the creation of several lines of resistance. The Chief of the General Staff was particularly concerned about the state of the communications troops and the Army command system. The repressions of the 1930s dealt a severe blow to the Red Army's command structure. Thousands of experienced officers were shot, including 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union. They were replaced by young but inexperienced commanders, many of whom did not have sufficient training to lead large units. Zhukov understood this problem perfectly well, as he himself had miraculously escaped repression. In 1938, he was summoned to the NKVD to testify in the military conspiracy case. But the intercession of influential patrons saved the future Marshal from arrest. Many of his colleagues were less fortunate and perished in the camps, taking with them invaluable military experience. Working 18 hours a day, Zhukov tried to solve an impossible task: to bring the army to combat readiness in the shortest possible time. He demanded the acceleration of the production of new types of tanks and aircraft, insisted on improving the training of pilots and tankers, and sought to improve the supply of troops. But time was running out, and the bureaucratic machine was slow. At the same time, the Chief of the General Staff tried to convince Stalin of the need to bring the troops to full combat readiness. Intelligence reported the concentration of German troops on the Soviet borders, but the leader categorically forbade any actions that could provoke Hitler into a premature attack. Zhukov found himself in a very difficult position. He saw the impending catastrophe, but could not prevent it. Tensions reached their peak in early June 1941, when information was received that the Germans had completed the deployment of their strike forces. Zhukov insisted on immediately bringing the border districts to combat readiness, but Stalin still did not allow provocative actions. A serious conflict arose between the leader and the chief of the general staff, which nearly cost Zhukov his career and his freedom. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m., the German army attacked the Soviet borders without a declaration of war. More than 3.5 million German soldiers, supported by 4,000 tanks and 5,000 aircraft, began Operation Barbarossa, a plan for the lightning defeat of the USSR. Despite all the warnings from intelligence, the attack came as a surprise to the Red Army. The troops in the border districts were caught off guard and suffered catastrophic losses. Zhukov was in his office at the General Staff headquarters when, at 3:30 a.m., he was informed of the start of hostilities. The first reports were fragmentary and contradictory, but within an hour it became clear that a real catastrophe was unfolding. The Germans were striking simultaneously in 3 directions: Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. Their air force dominated the skies, destroying most of the Soviet aircraft right on the airfields. At 4:30 a.m., Zhukov called Stalin at his dacha in Kuntsevo. The leader, awakened in the middle of the night, did not initially believe the report from the chief of the general staff. "This is a provocation by the German generals," he said. "Hitler must know about this." But as more and more alarming reports came in from the front, it became clear that a real war had begun. The very war they had been preparing for so long and feared so much. By noon on June 22nd, the picture of what was happening became clear. German tank wedges had broken through the defenses in all directions and were rushing deep into Soviet territory. The Western Front, under the command of General Pavlov, had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. The Northwestern and Southwestern fronts were also in a critical situation. Contact with most of the units had been lost. Stalin arrived at the Kremlin only on the evening of June 22nd, and the meeting that took place revealed the full extent of the disaster. Zhukov reported the loss of control over a front stretching more than 2,000 kilometers. The Germans were advancing at such a speed that the Soviet command simply did not have time to take adequate countermeasures. The old defense plans proved untenable in the face of the German blitzkrieg. The first days of the war proved the warnings that Zhukov had repeatedly voiced in the pre-war months to be correct. The Red Army was not ready for modern motorized warfare. The troop command system could not withstand the enemy's onslaught. Communication with the units was paralyzed, and supplies were disrupted. Many commanders, having received orders to attack, simply did not understand how to carry them out in the current situation. The situation was particularly dire in Belarus, where the German tank groups of Gotha and Guderian rushed towards each other, threatening to encircle the main forces of the Western Front. Zhukov insisted on the immediate withdrawal of troops across the Dnieper, but Stalin categorically forbade any retreat. "Not one step back," was his response to all proposals for a strategic retreat. On June 27th, the German pincer closed in on Minsk, and 2 armies of the Western Front, more than 300,000 men, were surrounded. It was the first, but far from the last, catastrophe of the early period of the war. Zhukov understood that if the existing methods of commanding troops remained unchanged, such encirclements would be repeated again and again. On June 30th, due to the failure of the defense on the Western Front, Army General Pavlov was removed from command of the Western Front. Along with him, the Chief of Staff of the Front and the commander of the Front's Air Force were arrested. All 3 were accused of criminal negligence and cowardice. A few days later, they were shot. These repressions were intended to show that Stalin would not tolerate defeat or retreat. In these circumstances, Zhukov found himself in an extremely difficult position. As Chief of the General Staff, He was responsible for the overall planning of military operations, but his ability to influence the course of events was limited by Stalin's categorical prohibitions on retreat. Any suggestion of withdrawing troops was seen as defeatism and could cost a person their career or even their life. July 1941 brought new disasters. The Germans surrounded and destroyed the main forces of the Western Front near Smolensk, broke through to Leningrad, and captured most of Ukraine. The Red Army's losses were estimated at millions of dead, wounded, and prisoners. It seemed that the USSR was on the verge of complete military collapse, and only a miracle could save the country from final defeat. It was during these critical weeks that Zhukov's best qualities as a military leader were fully revealed. He did not panic, remained clear-headed, and tirelessly sought ways to turn the situation around. Georgy Konstantinovich understood that the main task at the moment was to buy time to mobilize reserves and reorganize the economy for war. Each day of resistance brought the moment closer, when the balance of power would begin to shift in favor of the Soviet Union. In August 1941, when German troops were advancing on Leningrad, Stalin made a decision that many considered reckless. He sent Zhukov to command the Leningrad front, effectively condemning one of his best commanders to participate in what seemed like a hopeless battle. The northern capital was practically surrounded, its defenders demoralized, and German tanks were only a few dozen kilometers from the city limits. On September 10th, Zhukov arrived in besieged Leningrad and immediately assessed the catastrophic situation. German troops of Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Lieb, closed the blockade ring, cutting the city off from the mainland. Finnish troops were advancing from the north, threatening to cut off all supply routes completely. Famine was beginning in the city, ammunition was running out, and the morale of the defenders was falling with each passing day. The new front commander immediately set about radically restructuring the city's defenses. Zhukov understood that in the current circumstances, the main thing was to prevent panic and maintain the will to resist. He introduced the strictest discipline, announcing that the slightest sign of cowardice or desertion would be punished by firing squad. At the same time, he personally visited the positions, inspiring soldiers and commanders by his own example. Zhukov turned Leningrad into an impregnable fortress, using every building and every street to organize the defense. He ordered all important objects to be mined and prepared for explosion in case of a German breakthrough. Workers at the Kirov plant repaired tanks right in the workshops and sent them to the front, where they entered battle with welds that had not yet cooled down. The first serious test of Leningrad's defenses came just a few days after Zhukov's arrival. The Germans made a desperate attempt to storm the city, throwing their best divisions at it. But the Soviet troops, under the leadership of their new commander, met the attackers with organized fire. Every house became a fortress, every street a battlefield. Particularly fierce battles unfolded on the southern approaches to the city, where the Germans tried to break through the Pulkovo Heights. Zhukov personally directed the defense of this key section, repeatedly appearing on the most dangerous parts of the front. His presence inspired the soldiers, who saw that their commander shared all the hardships of battle with them. One of Zhukov's key decisions was to create artillery groups that could quickly concentrate fire on threatened areas. Ships of the Baltic Fleet, stationed in the Neva and the Gulf of Finland, were also included in the city's defense system. Their powerful guns could hit targets at a considerable distance from the coastline, creating an additional fire barrier against German troops. Equally important was the psychological work among the city's defenders. Zhukov understood that in the conditions of a blockade, the moral factor was of decisive importance. He organized a system of political and educational work to maintain the fighting spirit of the troops. Particular attention was paid to working with middle-ranking commanders, as the morale of the rank and file depended on them. By the end of September, it became clear that the German command's plans for a quick capture of Leningrad had failed. The city continued to resist, despite all attempts to storm it. Hitler, who had counted on the quick fall of the northern capital, was forced to transfer significant forces from Army Group North to the Moscow direction. This decision effectively saved Leningrad from complete encirclement and destruction. However, the success of the defense came at a terrible price. Zhukov was forced to use extremely harsh methods to maintain discipline and combat readiness among the troops. Executions for cowardice and desertion became commonplace. Many officers later recalled that they feared Zhukov more than the Germans, but it was this iron cruelty that allowed him to maintain control of his troops at critical moments. On October 14, 1941, Zhukov received an order from Stalin to urgently report to Moscow. The capital was under threat, and the leader decided to put a commander who had already proven his ability to hold besieged cities at the head of its defense. Handing over command of the front to General Fedyuninsky, Zhukov could proudly say that he had accomplished his task. Leningrad had held out. The experience of defending Leningrad became an important lesson for Zhukov in commanding troops in extreme conditions. He learned to make tough decisions without fear of taking responsibility for the lives of thousands of people. This experience would serve him well in the battles ahead, where the fate of the entire country would be at stake. Leningrad had held out, but an even more serious test lay ahead: the battle for Moscow. When Zhukov arrived in Moscow on October 14, 1941, the capital was in a state of near panic. German troops from Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Bock, were rapidly approaching the city, sweeping away the remnants of the Soviet defenses in their path. Operation Typhoon, the plan to capture Moscow, was progressing extremely successfully for the Germans. They had already broken through to the Mozhaisk defense line and threatened to encircle the capital. The situation in the city was critical. The evacuation of government agencies, factories, and cultural treasures began. Many residents of Moscow, succumbing to panic, tried to leave the city. Rumors circulated that Stalin had already left for Kuibyshev and that the resistance would soon end. In these circumstances, Zhukov's appointment as commander of the Western Front was a last-ditch attempt to save the capital of the Soviet Union. Georgy Konstantinovich immediately set about studying the situation on the approaches to Moscow. The picture that unfolded before him was depressing. The front did not actually exist as a single entity. Separate, scattered groups of Soviet troops were resisting the Germans, but there was no overall defense plan. Communication between units had been disrupted, and supplies were not functioning. Zhukov understood that he had only a few days to organize the defense of Moscow. German tank wedges were only 50 to 80 kilometers from the capital, and continued their advance. There was no time to create a deeply echeloned defense, so they had to improvise, using every day and every hour to strengthen their positions. The first thing the new front commander did was to restore control of the troops. He created several operational groups, each of which was responsible for a specific section of the front. Communication with these groups was maintained via radio and couriers. Zhukov personally controlled all the main directions, not trusting such an important task to his subordinates. The commander paid particular attention to the organization of anti-tank defense. German tank divisions posed the main threat to Moscow, and it was necessary to stop their advance at all costs. Zhukov ordered anti-tank barriers to be set up on all major roads leading to the capital. Tank traps, minefields, anti-tank guns. All this was supposed to slow down the German offensive. An equally important task was to mobilize all available reserves. Zhukov managed to transfer units from other sections of the front to Moscow. Cadets from military schools, workers' battalions, and militias were thrown into battle. Every man capable of bearing arms became a defender of the capital. Quantity was supposed to compensate for the lack of quality training. At the same time, Zhukov worked to strengthen the morale of the troops. He understood that in the current situation, the psychological factor was crucial. The commander personally visited the positions, talked to soldiers and officers, explaining to them the importance of the upcoming battles. His presence on the front lines inspired the soldiers. showing them that the leadership had no intention of surrendering Moscow without a fight. By the end of October, the Germans had approached the outskirts of the capital. Their advance units reached Krasnaya Polyana, from where, in clear weather, the building of Moscow State University on Lenin Hills was visible. It seemed that the fall of Moscow was a matter of days. Western correspondents were already preparing reports on the capture of the Soviet capital, and German propaganda was trumpeting an imminent victory. But Zhukov had no intention of surrendering. He turned every house and every street into a stronghold of defense. Moscow was preparing for street fighting, just like Stalingrad a year later. All important objects were mined. Bridges and factories were prepared for demolition. If the Germans entered the city, they would not receive an easy trophy, but a pile of ruins, for which they would have to pay with blood for every meter. On November 1st, the last German offensive on Moscow began. The enemy threw all its reserves into the battle, hoping to break Soviet resistance with one powerful blow. 3 German tank groups rushed towards the capital from the north, west, and south, seeking to surround the city and force it to surrender. It was the moment of truth for the defense of Moscow, and for Zhukov personally. The fighting was exceptionally fierce. The Germans, realizing that time was working against them, attacked with desperate determination. The Soviet troops fought with no less tenacity, knowing that the heart of their homeland was behind them. The losses on both sides were enormous, but the front held. Each day of Moscow's defense brought closer the moment when the initiative in the war would begin to shift to the Red Army. The November battles for Moscow were the culmination of the German offensive on the Soviet capital, and, at the same time, the beginning of a radical turning point in the war. Zhukov, who took responsibility for the defense of the city, understood that the outcome of the battle would determine not only the fate of Moscow, but also the entire Great Patriotic War. German troops, exhausted by months of fighting, made a last desperate attempt to capture the Soviet capital before the onset of winter. On November 7, 1941, a military parade was held on Red Square, an event that shook not only the Soviet people, but the entire world. While German tanks were just a few dozen kilometers from the Kremlin, regiments marched across the cobblestones of the country's main square, heading straight from the parade to the front. Zhukov, standing on the mausoleum tribune next to Stalin, saw this parade as a symbol of the people's unyielding will to resist. After the parade, the commander of the Western Front returned to his direct duties, leading the defense of the capital. By this time, the Germans had launched a new offensive, concentrating their main efforts on the northern and southern flanks of the Moscow defensive line. The German command's plan was to encircle Moscow and force it to surrender without bloody street fighting. In the north, German troops attempted to break through Dmitrov and Yakroma to the Moscow Sea in order to cut off the Moscow Canal and deprive the capital of its water supply. At the same time, Guderian's tank group advanced from the south, with the aim of capturing Tula and reaching Moscow from the rear. Zhukov understood the criticality of the situation and threw all available reserves into repelling these attacks. The situation was particularly tense near Tula, where Soviet troops fought desperately against superior enemy forces. The city was of strategic importance as a major industrial center and transport hub. Its fall would have opened a direct route to Moscow for the Germans from the south. Zhukov personally coordinated the actions of the Tula garrison, demanding that the city be held at all costs. The situation was no less critical on the northern approaches to the capital, where the Germans managed to force the Moscow Canal and establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank. This was a direct threat to Moscow, as the distance from the bridgehead to the city was only 30 kilometers. Zhukov immediately organized a counterattack with the forces of the Siberian divisions that had arrived and managed to eliminate the enemy bridgehead. By the end of November, it became clear that the German offensive was running out of steam. The troops of Army Group Center, which had been advancing since June without any serious rest, were badly worn out and demoralized. The harsh Russian winter, for which the German army was unprepared, finished the job. Wehrmacht soldiers suffered from the cold, equipment broke down, and supplies were disrupted. Zhukov closely monitored the changing situation and came to the conclusion that the time had come to launch a counteroffensive. He understood that the Soviet troops had a short window of opportunity. The Germans were weakened, and the divisions that had arrived from Siberia were still full of strength and better adapted to winter conditions. There was no time to delay, as the enemy could receive reinforcements in the spring and resume their offensive. On December 3rd, Zhukov reported to Stalin on his plan for a counteroffensive near Moscow. The plan was to launch simultaneous strikes on the flanks of Army Group Center, encircle and destroy the enemy's main forces, and then advance towards Smolensk. Stalin approved the plan, realizing that this was the only chance to turn the tide of the war in his favor. On December 6, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow began. After 4 months of retreat, the Red Army launched its first decisive offensive against the Wehrmacht. The blow came as a complete surprise to the Germans. They believed that the Red Army was bleeding to death and incapable of serious offensive action. The first days of the counteroffensive proved Zhukov's calculations to be correct. The Soviet troops, inspired by the transition to active operations, delivered one blow after another to the demoralized German units. The enemy, unprepared for winter warfare, was unable to organize effective resistance. The retreat of Army Group Center began, which soon turned into a full-fledged flight. By the end of December, Soviet troops had pushed the Germans back from Moscow to a distance of 100 to 250 kilometers. Tula was liberated, and the immediate threat to the capital was eliminated. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the German army suffered a serious defeat, dispelling the myth of its invincibility. Zhukov proved that he was capable not only of defending, but also of attacking, crushing the enemy with his own methods. The Battle of Moscow became a turning point in Zhukov's career. And in the course of the entire war, the commander who saved the capital of the Soviet Union received nationwide recognition and Stalin's unconditional trust. It was from this moment that Georgy Konstantinovich became the leading figure in the Soviet military leadership, the man to whom they turned in the most critical moments of the war. After the successful counteroffensive near Moscow, Zhukov's reputation as an invincible commander was finally established. Stalin increasingly involved him in planning major operations on various sections of the front. In the summer of 1942, when German troops rushed towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, it was Zhukov who was tasked with coordinating the actions of the fronts defending the city on the Volga. On August 27, 1942, Zhukov was appointed Deputy Supreme Commander-in-Chief, effectively the second-in-command in the USSR's military hierarchy. This appointment underscored Stalin's special trust in the commander, who had already twice, at Leningrad and Moscow, proven his ability to turn the tide of the most hopeless battles. Now he faced an even more difficult task: saving Stalingrad. By the time Zhukov arrived in the combat zone, the situation at Stalingrad was critical. Paulus's German 6th Army, supported by Gott's 4th Panzer Army, had broken through to the Volga and engaged in bloody battles in the city itself. Soviet troops of the Stalingrad and southeastern fronts suffered enormous losses, defending every house and every street from the superior forces of the enemy. Zhukov understood that direct frontal attacks against the Germans entrenched in the city would not be successful. A radically different strategy was needed, not an assault on Stalingrad, but the encirclement of the entire German group. After studying the situation, he came to the conclusion that the flanks of the German wedge, stretching to the Volga, were covered by weak Romanian and Italian troops, which could be broken through with a sudden strike. Together with Chief of General Staff Vasilevsky, Zhukov developed Operation Uranus, a grand plan to encircle German troops near Stalingrad. The plan was to launch simultaneous attacks from the north and south of the city, break through the defenses of Germany's allies, and join forces in the Kalach area, closing the ring around the entire enemy group. It was an operation of unprecedented scale, Preparations for Operation Uranus required enormous effort. It was necessary to secretly concentrate huge masses of troops, equipment, and ammunition in their starting positions, without arousing the enemy's suspicion. Zhukov personally supervised each stage of preparation, demanding strict adherence to secrecy from the front commanders. The slightest leak of information could have ruined the entire operation. Particular attention was paid to the creation of strike groups, capable of breaking through enemy defenses and rapidly developing the offensive. These groups included the best tank and mechanized corps, reinforced by artillery and aviation. Zhukov understood that the success of the operation depended on the pace of the offensive. It was necessary to close the encirclement before the Germans could transfer reserves to unblock Paulus. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus began. After a powerful artillery barrage, Soviet troops of the southwestern and Don fronts launched an offensive north of Stalingrad. The Romanian units that took the first blow could not withstand the onslaught and began to retreat. The gaps that formed were immediately exploited by Soviet tank corps. At the same time, on November 20th, the Stalingrad front launched an offensive south of the city. Here, too, Romanian and German units were unable to withstand the powerful blow of the Soviet troops. The command of Army Group Don was unprepared for such a large-scale offensive by the Red Army and failed to organize a timely counterattack. On November 23rd, the advanced units of the two Soviet fronts joined forces in the Kalach area, closing the encirclement around the German troops in Stalingrad. 22 divisions of the 6th Army and units of the 4th Tank Army, more than 300,000 men, found themselves in the cauldron. This was the largest encirclement of German troops since the beginning of the war, which radically changed the strategic situation on the southern flank of the Soviet-German front. Zhukov understood perfectly well that the encirclement of Paulus's group was only the beginning of the operation. Ahead lay the task of holding the encirclement against attempts to break it from the outside, and at the same time, destroying the encircled troops. The German command could not accept the loss of an entire army and was preparing a powerful relief operation codenamed Winter Storm. On December 12th, the German operation to relieve the troops surrounded in Stalingrad began. Army Group Don, under the command of Field Marshal Manstein, launched an attack from the Kotelnikovo area in the direction of Stalingrad. The strike force included the Wehrmacht's best tank divisions, including the elite SS Viking division. It seemed that breaking through the thin encirclement would be easy, but Zhukov was ready for such a development. He had created a powerful group of troops in advance to repel the unblocking strike and launch a counterattack on the advancing German troops. When Gota's army group approached the Mishkovaya River, just 50 kilometers from the encircled Paulus, Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive and stopped the German advance. The attempt to break out failed. In the spring of 1943, after the triumphant victory at Stalingrad, the German command was preparing its last major offensive operation on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel involved a powerful strike against Soviet troops in the Kursk area, with the aim of encircling and destroying a significant part of the Red Army. Hitler hoped to regain the strategic initiative and show the world that the Wehrmacht was still capable of decisive victories. Stalin enlisted his best commanders to plan the defense of the Kursk salient, and Zhukov played a key role in this process. Analyzing intelligence data on the concentration of German troops, he concluded that the enemy was preparing an operation to cut off the Kursk salient with strikes from the north and south. This was a classic encirclement tactic that the Germans had used successfully at the beginning of the war. Zhukov proposed a fundamentally new strategy for conducting defensive operations. Instead of trying to hold the salient at all costs, he insisted on creating a deeply echeloned defense that would wear down the advancing German troops and then launch a decisive counteroffensive. It was a strategy of active defense, followed by a transition to the offensive. Preparations for the Battle of Kursk were carried out with unprecedented thoroughness. Soviet troops created 8 defensive lines with a total depth of up to 300 kilometers. The density of minefields reached record levels, up to 5,000 mines per kilometer of the front. Every settlement was turned into a stronghold, capable of withstanding a prolonged siege. Zhukov personally supervised the creation of anti-tank defenses, understanding that tank units would play a major role in the upcoming battle. The Germans concentrated their best tank divisions for Operation Citadel, including the newest Tigers and Panthers. The Soviet defense had to withstand the onslaught of this steel avalanche and bleed the enemy's tank forces dry. On July 5, 1943, German troops launched an offensive on the northern and southern fronts of the Kursk salient. The greatest battle in human history began, involving more than 4 million people, 13,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 70,000 artillery pieces on both sides. The fate of the war was at stake in this battle. On the northern flank, the advance of Model's German Ninth Army was halted in the first few days. The Soviet defense proved so strong that the enemy was unable to break through even to the first line of defense. Zhukov, who coordinated the actions of Rokossovsky's Central Front, noted with satisfaction that the calculations had been justified. German tanks were bogged down in the echeloned defense and suffered huge losses. A more dangerous situation developed on the southern flank, where the Army Group South Tank Group, under Manstein's command, managed to wedge itself into the Soviet defenses to a depth of 35 kilometers. Here, the Wehrmacht's best tank divisions were advancing, including the SS divisions Leibstandart, Reich, and Totenkopf. Their advance threatened to break through the entire defense of the Voronezh front. The Battle of Kursk culminated in the Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Zhukov, realizing the critical nature of the moment, authorized the deployment of Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army to launch a counterattack against the German troops that had broken through. More than 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns from both sides took part in the battle. The battle at Prokhorovka lasted all day and was marked by unprecedented ferocity. Tanks fought at extremely close range, often ramming each other. The battlefield was littered with burning vehicles, and smoke covered everything around. By evening, the Germans were forced to stop their offensive, having failed to break through the Soviet defenses. Operation Citadel had failed. On July 12th, the day of the battle at Prokhorovka, troops from the Western and Bryansk fronts launched an offensive in the Ural area, beginning Operation Kutuzov. This offensive was part of an overall counteroffensive plan developed with Zhukov's participation. The Germans were forced to withdraw troops from the Kursk direction to repel new attacks by Soviet forces. On August 3rd, Operation Commander Rumyantsev began, an offensive by the Voronezh and Steppe fronts in the Belgorod-Kharkov direction. Zhukov coordinated the actions of the advancing fronts, achieving maximum speed of advance. The goal was to prevent the enemy from gaining a foothold at intermediate lines and to advance to the Dnieper River. By the end of August, Soviet troops had liberated Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkov. German troops retreated westward, suffering enormous losses in manpower and equipment. The Battle of Kursk ended in a complete victory for the Red Army and marked the final transition of the strategic initiative to the Soviet side. Zhukov made a decisive contribution to this victory, demonstrating outstanding abilities in planning and conducting large-scale operations. The victory at the Kursk Bulge was a triumph for Soviet military art and for Georgy Zhukov personally. For the first time during the war, the Red Army deliberately took the enemy's blow, wore it down in defensive battles, and then launched a powerful counteroffensive. This strategy became a model for many subsequent operations and demonstrated the maturity of the Soviet military leadership. After the victory at the Kursk Bulge, broad prospects for offensive operations opened up for the Soviet command. The German army, which had suffered heavy losses in the summer battles of 1943, was no longer able to conduct active strategic defense across the entire front. Zhukov, who by this time had acquired the informal status of Stalin's chief military advisor, played a key role in planning the liberation operations in Ukraine. The main goal of the Red Army's autumn offensive was to force the Dnieper and liberate the left bank of Ukraine. Zhukov understood that the Germans would try to turn the Dnieper into an impregnable defensive line, using it as a natural obstacle to stop the Soviet offensive. Therefore, the main task was to cross the river on the move, not allowing the enemy to establish a strong defense. Preparations for crossing the Dnieper were carried out in strict secrecy. Zhukov coordinated the actions of 4 fronts: the central, Voronezh, Steppe, and southwestern. Each front was given a specific task to break through the German defenses and reach the Dnieper in a certain area. The synchronized actions of all fronts were supposed to ensure the success of the entire operation. On August 26, 1943, a general offensive of Soviet troops began in the Ukrainian direction. The operation was codenamed Chernigov-Poltava. German troops, weakened by the battles at Kursk and stretched across a huge front, were unable to effectively resist the powerful strike of the 4 Soviet fronts. Their hasty retreat to the Dnieper began. Zhukov personally controlled the pace of the offensive, demanding maximum speed of advance from the front commanders. He understood that every day of delay allowed the Germans to strengthen their defenses on the Dnieper and bring up reserves. Soviet troops had to reach the river before the enemy had time to organize a strong defense on its banks, according to all the rules of military art. By mid-September, the Red Army's advance units had reached the Dnieper, along a front stretching more than 700 kilometers. The Germans did indeed try to turn the river into an impregnable fortress, but they did not have enough time to create a continuous line of defense. Soviet troops immediately began crossing the Dnieper, using whatever means were at hand, from fishing boats to log rafts. The crossing of the Dnieper became one of the most heroic pages in the history of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet soldiers crossed the wide river under enemy fire, secured the western bank, and expanded their bridgeheads. More than 2,500 people were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for their exploits during the crossing of the Dnieper. It was a true display of mass heroism. Particularly fierce battles took place in the Kiev area, where Zhukov concentrated his main efforts to liberate the Ukrainian capital. The Germans understood the political and strategic importance of the city and were prepared to defend it at all costs. The first attempts to storm Kiev from the east were repelled, and Zhukov decided to move the main attack to another location. In October 1943, a brilliant operation was carried out to secretly transfer the main forces of the First Ukrainian Front from the Bukhrin bridgehead to the Lyutezh bridgehead north of Kiev. This regrouping was carried out in strict secrecy, and the Germans had no idea that a new attack was being prepared. Zhukov personally supervised every stage of the operation. On November 3rd, the offensive began from the Lyutezh bridgehead. The attack was launched in the most unexpected place for the enemy, and the German defenses were broken through on the very first day. Soviet tank corps rushed towards Kiev without encountering serious resistance. On November 6th, the capital of Ukraine was liberated, and German troops began a hasty retreat to the west. The liberation of Kiev was of enormous political significance. It was the first major European city liberated by the Red Army, and its fall made a strong impression on the USSR's allies. Zhukov received well-deserved recognition as the architect of the operation to liberate the ancient Russian city. His reputation as an invincible commander was reinforced by yet another brilliant victory. After the liberation of Kiev, Soviet troops continued their offensive, liberating Ukrainian cities one after another. By the end of 1943, a significant part of left bank Ukraine had been liberated, and in some areas of the front, Soviet troops had reached the borders of Poland. The strategic initiative had finally passed to the Red Army. Operation Bagration, the planning of which began at the end of 1943, was to be the Red Army's next major offensive. Zhukov was actively involved in the development of this plan, which envisaged the defeat of the German Army Group Center in Belarus. This was to be one of the greatest victories in the history of Soviet military art, and Zhukov was preparing to play a key role in it. By the beginning of 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had changed dramatically in favor of the Soviet Union. The Red Army was steadily advancing across the entire front, and German troops were retreating, suffering huge losses. Under these conditions, the Soviet command planned to deliver a decisive blow to Army Group Center, which held the most important section of the front in Belarus and covered the direct route to Berlin. Zhukov, appointed coordinator of the 1st and 2nd Belarusian fronts, immersed himself in the preparation of Operation Bagration. It was to be the Red Army's largest offensive of the war, surpassing even the Stalingrad operation in scale. The plans called for the encirclement and complete destruction of the German Army Group Center, which would open the way for an advance on Warsaw and then Berlin. Preparations for the operation were carried out in strict secrecy. Zhukov demanded that all participants in the planning strictly observe the secrecy regime, understanding that surprise would be a key factor in success. The Germans were to be struck where they least expected it. To this end, complex measures were taken to misinform the enemy about the true intentions of the Soviet command. Zhukov paid particular attention to the creation of powerful strike groups capable of breaking through German defenses and developing the offensive at a rapid pace. These groups included the best tank and mechanized corps, Guards rifle divisions, and artillery units. Each strike group had a specific task in the overall plan of the operation. On June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years after the start of the war, Soviet troops launched an offensive in Belarus. The symbolism of the date was not accidental. The Red Army marked the tragic anniversary of the start of the war with a new victory over the aggressor. Operation Bagration began with powerful artillery preparation, after which the rifle units went on the attack. The success exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The German defenses were breached in several places at once, and Soviet tank corps rushed into the gaps. Army Group Center, considered one of the strongest in the Wehrmacht, was not prepared for such a powerful blow. Its troops began a hasty retreat, which soon turned into a disorderly flight. Zhukov coordinated the actions of the advancing fronts, achieving maximum speed of advance. He understood that the main goal of the operation was not simply to repel the enemy, but to encircle and destroy its main forces. To do this, it was necessary to quickly get behind the retreating German troops and cut off their escape routes to the west. Every hour of delay allowed the enemy to slip out of the cauldron that was being prepared. By the end of June, Soviet troops had liberated Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. The German garrisons of these cities were completely destroyed or captured. The offensive was particularly successful in the Minsk direction, where the tank corps of the 3rd Belarusian Front rapidly advanced towards the capital of Belarus, threatening to encircle the main forces of the 4th German Army. On July 3rd, Soviet troops liberated Minsk, closing the encirclement around a large German group east of the city. The remnants of the 4th and 9th German armies, more than 100,000 men, found themselves in the cauldron. This was the second largest encirclement of German troops after Stalingrad. Zhukov personally supervised the operation to destroy the encircled group. Simultaneously with the elimination of the Minsk cauldron, Soviet troops continued their advance to the west. Zhukov understood that the enemy could not be given a respite to create a new line of defense. The pace of the offensive had to remain as high as possible so as not to allow the Germans to gain a foothold at intermediate lines. In 12 days of the operation, Soviet troops advanced 450 kilometers. On July 13th, Soviet troops reached the state border of the USSR, stepping onto enemy-occupied territory for the first time in 3 years of war. It was a historic moment, the beginning of the Red Army's liberation mission in Europe. Zhukov realized the significance of this event, understanding that the war would now be fought outside Soviet territory. By the end of July, Operation Bagration had ended in complete victory for the Soviet troops. Army Group Center was completely destroyed, losing more than 400,000 men killed and captured. The entire territory of Belarus and part of Lithuania were liberated. The front advanced westward by a distance of 450 to 600 kilometers. The success of Operation Bagration opened the way for Soviet troops to Warsaw and Berlin. Zhukov understood that equally difficult battles lay ahead in Poland and Germany. But the main goal had been achieved. The backbone of German defense on the Eastern Front had been broken, and the Wehrmacht could no longer effectively resist the advancing Red Army. The path to the lair of the fascist beast was open. By January 1945, the Red Army was on the approaches to Germany, preparing for the final decisive offensive of the war. German troops, which had suffered catastrophic losses in the 1944 campaign, desperately clung to every line, realizing that the very existence of the Third Reich was at stake. In these circumstances, Stalin entrusted Zhukov with the command of the First Belarusian Front, the front that was to deliver the main blow to Berlin. Zhukov's appointment as commander of the First Belarusian Front was a logical decision. Over the years of the war, he had proven himself to be a commander capable of solving the most complex tasks. Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration. Wherever Zhukov appeared, the Red Army was victorious. Now, he was about to crown his career by taking the capital of Nazi Germany. Preparations for the Vistula-Oder offensive began in December 1944. Zhukov understood that the upcoming offensive would be different from all previous operations. The Germans would fight with the desperation of the doomed, defending their native land. Every city and every village could turn into a fortress. A special strategy was needed to overcome enemy resistance. The main feature of Zhukov's plan was to focus on the highest possible pace of the offensive. He planned to break through the German defenses on the Vistula with a powerful strike and then rapidly advance to the Oder, not giving the enemy time to organize defenses at intermediate lines. It was a strategy of lightning war turned against its creators. On January 12, 1945, 2 days ahead of schedule, Soviet troops launched an offensive from the Magnushev and Puławy bridgeheads on the Vistula. Zhukov decided to start the operation ahead of schedule, after receiving information about the German counterattack on the bridgeheads. The element of surprise was a key factor in the initial success. The German defenses on the Vistula were broken through on the first day of the offensive. A powerful artillery barrage, involving more than 4,000 guns and mortars, literally plowed through the German positions. Soviet assault groups, following close behind the barrage, broke into the enemy trenches and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the demoralized defenders. Katukov and Bogdanov's tank armies were immediately brought into the breach. Soviet tankers, encountering no organized resistance, rapidly advanced into the depths of the German defenses, sowing panic in the enemy's rear. During the first 3 days of the offensive, Soviet troops advanced 70 kilometers, completely disorganizing the German defenses in the central sector of the Eastern Front. On January 17th, Warsaw was liberated. The Germans did not have time to organize a serious defense of the Polish capital and hastily retreated to the west. Zhukov personally entered the liberated city to assess the extent of the destruction caused by the occupiers. Warsaw was a pile of rubble. The Germans had methodically destroyed the city in retaliation for the uprising of 1944. After the liberation of Warsaw, the pace of the offensive increased even more. Soviet troops advanced at an unprecedented speed, covering 50 to 60 kilometers a day. The German command was unable to transfer reserves to organize defenses on the new front lines. The Wehrmacht's retreat increasingly resembled a disorderly flight. By the end of January, Soviet troops had reached the Oder, the last major water barrier before Berlin. The distance to the German capital was only 60 kilometers. Zhukov understood that the decisive moment of the war was near. But at the same time, he realized that the assault on Berlin would require careful preparation and enormous sacrifices. On February 2nd, The advanced units of the First Belarusian Front crossed the Oder and captured the Kustrin bridgehead, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. This was the last major water barrier on the way to the German capital. Zhukov could state with satisfaction that the Vistula-Oder operation had exceeded all expectations. In 23 days of the offensive, Soviet troops had advanced 500 kilometers. The success of the Vistula-Oder offensive effectively predetermined the outcome of the war. Germany was brought to its knees, its territory was occupied, and its capital was under direct threat. Zhukov proved that Soviet commanders had mastered the art of modern warfare at the highest level. The Red Army had become a powerful military machine capable of crushing any enemy. But the final, and perhaps most difficult test lay ahead. The storming of Berlin. Zhukov understood that the Germans would defend their capital with fanatical tenacity. Every street and every house would be turned into a fortress. The losses would be enormous on both sides. But there was no other way out. The war had to end in the lair of the fascist beast, and it was Zhukov who had the honor of putting the final nail in the coffin of this bloody battle. After the end of the war, in May 1945, Zhukov was at the peak of his fame and influence. He was a hero of the Soviet Union, Marshal of Victory, the man who accepted Germany's surrender and commanded the victory parade on Red Square. It seemed that his position was unshakable, and that his services to the motherland would forever ensure the favor of the authorities. However, Zhukov underestimated Stalin's suspicion and jealousy of other people's fame. In the first months after the victory, the leader began to show dissatisfaction with what he considered to be the Marshal's excessive popularity. Zhukov was praised in the press. His portraits hung next to those of Stalin, and the people saw him as a symbol of victory. For a paranoid dictator accustomed to unquestioning adoration, this state of affairs was unacceptable. The glory had to belong to him alone. The first warning sign was Zhukov's removal from his post as commander of the Soviet occupation forces in Germany in March 1946. Officially, this was presented as a promotion, an appointment to the post of commander of the Odessa military district. But Zhukov himself understood perfectly well the real reason for the transfer. Stalin was removing him from the center of political life. In June 1946, a case was brought against Zhukov for trophy furniture. The MGB accused the Marshal of illegally removing works of art and furniture from Germany for personal use. This accusation was absurd. By the standards of the time, Zhukov's actions were not only permissible, but encouraged by the leadership. However, the political situation had changed. The real blow to Zhukov was dealt in January 1947, at a meeting of the Supreme Military Council. Stalin personally attacked the Marshal with accusations of arrogance, Bonapartism, and creating his own clique in the army. The leader claimed that Zhukov was taking credit for other people's achievements and trying to downplay the role of the party in achieving victory. This was a typical Stalinist tactic, first to exalt, then to destroy. Zhukov tried to defend himself by reminding Stalin of his achievements and loyalty to the party. But all his arguments fell on deaf ears due to Stalin's distrust. The leader had already decided the Marshal's fate, and it was impossible to change it. Georgy Konstantinovich was removed from all posts in the Ministry of Defense and sent to command the Ural Military District, effectively into exile. The transfer to Sverdlovsk was a heavy blow for Zhukov. From the center of the country's political and military life, he was sent to the distant periphery, where his knowledge and experience were not in demand. The Marshal of Victory became an ordinary district commander, entrusted with routine administrative matters. It was a sophisticated form of moral abuse. Zhukov spent 5 years in the Ural Military District, from 1947 to 1952. These were years of forced silence and oblivion. He was not mentioned in the newspapers, and his name disappeared from official documents and memoirs. It seemed as if the Marshal of Victory had never existed, and that other people had won the war. Zhukov was particularly hurt by attempts to rewrite the history of the war and belittle his role in achieving victory. In the official version of events, Stalin himself was declared the main architect of victory, and the commanders were presented as mere executors of his brilliant plans. The Battle of Moscow, the Stalingrad epic, the Kursk bulge, the capture of Berlin. Everywhere the role of the leader was brought to the fore, while the merits of the military commanders were hushed up. In 1949, the situation became even more acute in connection with the so-called Leningrad affair. Stalin, suspecting a conspiracy among the party elite, decided to launch a preemptive strike against anyone who could pose a potential threat to his power. Despite his exile to Sverdlovsk, Zhukov was still considered a dangerous rival because of his popularity in army circles. The MGB launched a new investigation into the Marshal's activities, trying to find compromising evidence for a final showdown. Agents carefully studied his connections, perused his correspondence, and interrogated his colleagues and subordinates. The goal was clear: to find even the slightest reason to accuse Zhukov of treason or anti-Soviet activities. The Marshal understood that he was balancing on the edge of life and death. Particularly dangerous was the attempt to link Zhukov to the aviation case, the repression of designers and leaders of the aviation industry. Investigators tried to prove that the Marshal knew about sabotage in aviation and covered up for enemies of the people. Any careless word, any meeting with those who had been repressed could be grounds for arrest. In these circumstances, Zhukov showed courage and dignity, refusing to publicly repent for non-existent sins. He understood that admitting guilt would mean not only personal surrender, but also betrayal of the memory of all those who died for victory. The Marshal preferred to silently endure humiliation, preserving his inner dignity and faith in historical justice. Zhukov's position stabilized somewhat after Stalin became convinced of his complete loyalty. The Marshal made no attempts to oppose the regime, did not criticize the official version of the history of the war, and meekly carried out any orders from the leadership. His obedience convinced the dictator that the former victor no longer posed a threat. Nevertheless, the path back to big politics and army leadership remained closed to Zhukov until Stalin's death. The leader did not forget or forgive, and the Marshal's popularity among the people and the military continued to irritate him. The memoirs of those who participated in those events contain evidence of how Stalin would darken and change the subject when Zhukov's name was mentioned. The years of disgrace became a time of deep reflection for Zhukov, about the path he had traveled, the price of victory, and the fates of people who had gone through the crucible of war. The Marshal read a lot, studied the works of outstanding commanders of the past, and analyzed the operations of the Great Patriotic War. This forced leisure allowed him to reflect more deeply on his military experience. Particularly painful were his thoughts about his fallen comrades, about the millions of soldiers who did not live to see victory. Zhukov understood that many of them could have been saved with more skillful leadership, better preparation for war, and more rational use of human resources. These reflections left a deep mark on the Marshal's character, making him more reserved and philosophical. Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, opened a new page in Zhukov's life. Although his rehabilitation did not happen immediately, the very fact that his main persecutor had disappeared gave him hope for a return to active service. The Marshal patiently waited for his moment, preparing to serve his country again if necessary. Zhukov's disgrace was a striking example of the regime's ingratitude towards its heroes. The man who saved the country from fascist enslavement was sent into exile because of the suspicions of a paranoid dictator. But even in the most difficult years, Zhukov did not lose faith in justice and did not doubt that history would reward him for his service to the fatherland. Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, was a turning point in Zhukov's fate. Although his immediate rehabilitation was impossible due to opposition from the late leader's closest associates, the disappearance of his main persecutor opened up new opportunities. The Marshal patiently waited for his moment in exile in the Urals, closely following developments in Moscow. The new leadership of the country, headed by Georgy Malenkov, found itself in a difficult position. On the one hand, It was necessary to distance oneself from Stalin's most odious methods, and on the other, to prevent a complete revision of the results of the late dictator's rule. The question of Zhukov was particularly acute, as his popularity in the army and among the people made him a potentially influential political figure. The situation changed dramatically after the arrest of Lavrenti Beria in June 1953. The fall of the all-powerful head of the MGB removed the main obstacle to Zhukov's return. Nikita Khrushchev, who was fighting for leadership of the party, understood that the support of the renowned Marshal could significantly strengthen his position in this rivalry. In July 1953, Zhukov was summoned to Moscow to participate in Beria's arrest. This appointment had a deep symbolic meaning. The Marshal, whom Beria had persecuted for years, was now to arrest his persecutor. For Zhukov, it was sweet revenge for years of humiliation and insults. Beria's arrest went off without a hitch. Zhukov personally directed the operation, ensuring that the all-powerful minister was isolated from his subordinates and allies. His many years of experience in military operations came in handy in this case. Beria was taken by surprise and did not have time to resist. His arrest symbolized the end of an era of mass terror. After Beria's removal, Zhukov's gradual rehabilitation began. In February 1955, he was appointed Deputy Minister of Defense of the USSR. This appointment marked the Marshal's return to high politics and recognition of his services to the fatherland. Khrushchev needed the support of the army in his struggle for power, and counted on the help of the popular commander. Zhukov's return to active duty coincided with the beginning of the process of de-Stalinization. At the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, Khrushchev delivered a report on the cult of Stalin's personality. Zhukov, who was present at the Congress, witnessed the historic exposure of the crimes of the late dictator. Khrushchev's report made a deep impression on Zhukov. The Marshal knew many of the facts presented by the First Secretary from personal experience. Repression against the army's command staff, unfounded accusations of treason, ignoring warnings of an impending German attack. Zhukov had experienced all of this personally. For him, de-Stalinization meant not only personal rehabilitation, but also the restoration of historical justice. In October 1956, events took place that once again brought Zhukov to the forefront of the country's political life. The Hungarian uprising threatened Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Khrushchev decided on military intervention, and Zhukov, as the most authoritative military leader, was entrusted with command of the operation. Zhukov brilliantly accomplished the task. Soviet troops quickly suppressed the uprising, preventing the unrest from spreading to other countries in the socialist camp. The operation was carried out with minimal casualties and maximum efficiency. This strengthened Khrushchev's position and at the same time increased Zhukov's own authority. However, the success in Hungary also marked the beginning of new problems for the Marshal. Having strengthened his position in the party leadership, Khrushchev began to fear Zhukov's excessive influence in the army. The popular commander could become an obstacle to the First Secretary's sole leadership. Old Stalinist phobias about the Bonapartism of military leaders reared their heads again. In June 1957, Khrushchev faced a serious threat to his leadership from the so-called anti-party group of Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich. At the critical moment, Zhukov supported the First Secretary, ensuring the transfer of Central Committee members to Moscow for a decisive vote. This support saved Khrushchev's political career. After the defeat of the anti-party group, Zhukov was appointed to the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the highest party body. This appointment made him the only military man in the party's top leadership. It seemed that the Marshal had reached the pinnacle not only of his military career, but also of his political career. However, his triumph was short-lived. Khrushchev had not forgotten the lessons of history and was well aware of the danger of excessive military power. Just a few months after crushing the opposition, he began to prepare for Zhukov's removal from the leadership. The popular Marshal once again fell victim to political intrigue. But this time, his patron turned into his persecutor. In October 1957, while Zhukov was on an official visit to Yugoslavia, Khrushchev dealt him a crushing blow. The Central Committee plenum accused the Marshal of Bonapartism, violating Lenin's principles of army leadership and attempting to place the army above the party. Zhukov was expelled from the presidium of the Central Committee and removed from his post as Minister of Defense. His resignation in October 1957 was the second setback in Zhukov's career, but this time he took the blow more philosophically. The 60-year-old Marshal understood that his active career was coming to an end. He was tired of political games and accepted the decision to resign with relative calm. The main thing had been done. The country had been saved, the enemy had been defeated, and historical justice would prevail. Zhukov spent the last years of his life in Rublevka, near Moscow, in a state dacha that had been given to him as a tribute to his achievements. Here, far from the political turmoil, the Marshal took up what he had not had time for during his active service. Writing his memoirs, he understood the importance of preserving for posterity a truthful account of the war, the exploits of the people, and the price of victory. Working on his memoirs proved to be no less difficult than planning military operations. Every sentence was censored, every fact carefully checked. The authorities feared that the popular Marshal might use his memoirs to criticize the existing regime. Zhukov was forced to compromise, to gloss over sensitive issues, to smooth over conflicts with the country's leadership. The need to downplay the role of Stalin's repressions in weakening the army on the eve of the war was particularly painful. Zhukov knew the true price that the armed forces had paid for the mass executions of command personnel. But he could not write about it openly. The political situation demanded caution in assessing the activities of the late leader. Despite all the restrictions, Zhukov's memoirs became an outstanding document of the era. For the first time, Soviet people had the opportunity to learn the true history of the war from the mouth of its main architect. The book, Memories and Reflections, became a bestseller, selling millions of copies. Every family in the Soviet Union considered it their duty to own this book. Zhukov gained international recognition during his lifetime. Western historians and military experts unanimously recognized him as one of the greatest commanders of the 20th century. His name was placed on a par with Napoleon, Suvorov, and Alexander the Great. This recognition was especially valuable because it came from former adversaries who could objectively assess the Marshal's commanding talent. American and British military analysts particularly appreciated Zhukov's ability to strategically plan and coordinate the actions of large groups of troops. The operations near Moscow, Stalingrad, the Kursk Bulge, and the capture of Berlin became classic examples of military art, studied in military academies around the world. Equally important was the recognition of Zhukov's contribution to the development of military science. He was one of the first to understand the importance of tank forces in modern warfare, developed the basics of deep operations, and created new tactics for the use of artillery and aviation. Many of his innovations were ahead of their time and became part of the world's military art. Zhukov's ability to adapt to changing conditions of war was particularly highly valued. While at the beginning of the conflict, he was forced to focus mainly on defense, he then brilliantly mastered the art of offensive operations. This flexibility of thinking and ability to learn and improve set him apart from many other military leaders. Zhukov's personal qualities as a commander were also highly praised by researchers. His iron will, fearlessness, and ability to take responsibility for the most difficult decisions made him indispensable in critical situations. It was no coincidence that Stalin always turned to Zhukov when the situation became critical. At the same time, critics rightly noted Zhukov's harsh methods and his willingness to accept enormous losses in order to achieve his goals. The Marshal belonged to a generation of commanders for whom human lives were a bargaining chip in a big game. This character trait was a product of the era and does not detract from his achievements as a commander. Zhukov's influence on the development of the Soviet armed forces cannot be overestimated. Many of his students and followers became outstanding military leaders who applied the principles developed by the Marshal in the post-war period. Zhukov's school of military art determined the development of the Soviet army for decades. Zhukov's death on June 18, 1974, marked the end of an era in the country's history. The last of the great commanders of the Great Patriotic War, a legendary figure, the Marshal of Victory, had passed away. His funeral on Red Square was attended by hundreds of thousands of Muscovites who came to say goodbye to their national hero. Zhukov's legacy lives on today. Streets and squares in cities are named after him. Monuments have been erected in his honor, and dozens of books and films have been written and made about him. But the main monument to Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov is the free Russia that he defended in a deadly battle against fascism. As long as the memory of the Great Patriotic War lives on, so will the memory of its main architect, Marshal of Victory Georgy Zhukov. History has proven right those who saw Zhukov as the greatest commander of the era. Time has put everything in its place, separating true merit from political expediency. Today, Zhukov's name stands in the pantheon of great Russian commanders, alongside the names of Suvorov, Kutuzov, and Rumyantsev. And rightly so, he is worthy of such a place.